George Patton had the legal authority to execute his own officers, not threaten them, not demote them, execute them, and under wartime law, no one could have stopped him, but that's not what Patton did. Instead of killing them, he chose something he believed was far worse. He let them live. He stripped them of command, erased their place among combat leaders, and forced them to exist inside the army as men everyone knew had failed under fire. This is the paradox at the heart of Patton's leadership. The man famous for brutality rejected the clean finality of death and replaced it with something slower. Not punishment meant to satisfy justice, but punishment designed to control behavior, fear, and belief across an entire army. This is not a story about mercy or restraint. It's a story about how Patton understood what officers truly live for: reputation, command, and belonging, and why he believed that taking those away was more powerful than a firing squad could ever be. If you think this story is about mercy, keep watching. And if you want more World War II stories that expose the uncomfortable decisions history prefers to forget, subscribe now. In August 1944, speed was everything. The Allied breakout from Normandy had shattered the German front, and George S. Patton's Third Army was moving faster than anyone believed possible. Columns of American armor tore through northern France, overrunning German positions, seizing towns before retreating units could reorganize, and exploiting a rare moment when the enemy was disoriented and vulnerable. This was the kind of war Patton had trained his entire life. To fight, monem was sacred. Hesitation was deadly. Not reports of German counterattacks or fuel shortages, not warnings of ambushes or collapsing supply lines. These reports were quieter, more disturbing, and far more dangerous. Officers, American officers, captains, majors, even senior field officers, who had stopped leading their men under fire, who remained in bunkers or rear positions while their soldiers advanced, fought, and died without direction. In combat, failure spreads fast. A single hesitant officer can stall an entire company. A commander who does not move forward becomes an obstacle, not a leader. And in the chaos of 1944, hesitation cost lives immediately. Soldiers depended on their officers not just for orders but for courage. When that courage vanished, units unraveled. Patton understood this better than anyone. To him, leadership was not a title. It was an obligation that only existed under fire. An officer who could not function in battle was not merely ineffective. Military law was clear. Under wartime regulations, cowardice or dereliction of duty in the face of the enemy was punishable by court-martial. In extreme cases, it was punishable by death. Patton knew this. He had enforced discipline harshly before his reputation for severity was already infamous across the army. So when faced with officers who had failed in combat, Patton did not lack options. He possessed legal authority, he possessed precedent, and he possessed the political cover that came with success on the battlefield. Executions would have been lawful. Courts-martial would have been defensible. Many commanders in many armies had chosen exactly that path, not because he doubted his authority and not because he questioned the severity of the offense. He hesitated because he understood what executing officers would actually do to his army. These were not anonymous soldiers. They were trained leaders, many of them products of elite officer programs, men who represented the professional core of the United States Army. Public trials would not simply punish individuals. They would raise questions about training, selection, and competence at the highest levels. They would ripple outward, undermining confidence among officers who were still performing under fire. And worse, they would slow everything down. Trials took time, and time was the one resource Patton could not afford to lose. His army was racing across France, operating at the edge of its supply lines, relying on speed to stay ahead of German recovery. A legal process that dragged on for weeks was not discipline. It was friction. There was also the problem of exposure. Executing American officers for cowardice would not remain an internal matter. It would reach newspapers. Families would demand answers. Politicians would intervene. The story would shift from battlefield momentum to domestic controversy. Patton had no interest in fighting the war on two fronts, replacing them quietly without consequence. Risk signaling weakness. Patton needed a solution that was immediate, decisive, and terrifying to the right audience. This was the moment where Patton made a calculation that defined the rest of the campaign. He asked himself a simple question, not what punishment was morally satisfying, but what punishment would most effectively shape behavior across the entire officer corps. Patton understood something fundamental about military culture, especially among career officers. Their identity was not rooted in survival. It was rooted in command, in reputation, in being trusted to lead men into danger and emerge victorious. Living on without command was different. To be relieved quietly, reassigned away from combat, and marked as someone who had failed under fire meant continued existence inside the institution that defined you. While being permanently excluded from its highest purpose, it meant watching peers advance, earn decorations, and make history while you remained behind. It meant that everyone knew why you were there. Patton realized that this fate would terrify officers far more effectively than execution ever could. Death was final. This was enduring. And so in August 1944, at the height of his Army's momentum, Patton chose not to kill Fed officers. He chose to erase them instead. Patton did not invent fear. He simply understood where it already lived. For most men in uniform, survival is the goal. But for career officers, survival alone is meaningless. An officer's identity is built around command, around the belief that when everything collapses, he will still be standing, still giving orders. Strip that away, and you take far more than a rank or a job. You take the core of who he believes himself to be. This is the psychological terrain Patton operated on. An infantry officer in 1944 was not measured by paperwork or seniority. He was measured by performance under fire. Could he move forward when shells were falling? Could he make decisions when information was incomplete and people were dying around him? Could he project confidence when fear was unavoidable? Those who could were respected instantly. Those who could not were remembered forever. Patton understood that officers lived inside an informal hierarchy far more powerful than any written regulation. Reputation mattered more than promotion. Respect mattered more than medals. And nothing destroyed both faster than being known as the officer who froze. In theory, the law treated failure as an offense to be judged. In reality, the officer corps treated failure as contamination. One incident under fire could define an entire career. Patton did not need to announce punishment publicly. He only needed to remove an officer from combat command and let the system do the rest. This is why his solution required no paperwork. When Patton relieved an officer, it was swift and final. There were no formal charges, no hearings, just a brief conversation and a reassignment order. The officer was no longer leading men. He was no longer part of the fight. He was sent somewhere safe, somewhere necessary, somewhere deeply humiliating. The brutality of this choice lay in what came next. Because in a combat army, nothing stays secret. Within days, sometimes hours, everyone knew, not through official channels, but through the invisible network that carries reputation faster than any communique. An officer who disappeared from the front did not need an explanation. The absence itself was the explanation. He froze. He couldn't move. Patton pulled him. Those three facts were enough. Unlike a court-martial, there was no moment of closure, no verdict, no sentence that could be served and left behind. The officer remained inside the army wearing the same uniform, saluting the same superiors, but now permanently defined by what he was no longer allowed to do. He still woke up every morning knowing the war continued without him. He still read reports of advances he was not part of. He still watched peers rotate through command positions he would never hold again. The punishment renewed itself every day. Patton knew this would be devastating, but devastation was the point. A firing squad ends fear, a quiet removal multiplies it. Every officer in the Third Army understood the message immediately. You did not need to be perfect. Patton was not unreasonable. Single moments of confusion could be forgiven. Patterns of hesitation could not. But if you failed decisively under fire, you would not be corrected. You would be erased. Courts-martial punished individuals. Patton's approach reshaped behavior across the entire officer corps. The threat was not death. The threat was exile from relevance. And unlike legal punishment, this threat could not be appealed. There was no defense attorney to argue stress or confusion. Once Patton decided you were unfit to lead men in combat, that judgment became your permanent shadow. This is where the deeper paradox emerges. Patton was often portrayed as impulsive, emotional, even reckless, but this system was calculated. It balanced speed, deterrence, and control with precision. The Army moved forward without pausing to adjudicate individual weakness. More importantly, Patton preserved belief. Belief that leadership mattered, belief that failure had consequences, belief that command was a privilege that could be taken away without ceremony. To the soldiers on the line, this mattered. They needed to know that incompetence would not be tolerated, that if their leader failed, he would not be protected by rank or procedure. Patton's method delivered that assurance without spectacle. But this efficiency came at a cost. There was no room for context. Fear, exhaustion, and psychological collapse were treated as facts of war, not excuses. An officer who broke once might never be given another chance, regardless of past service or future potential. The system was ruthless because Patton believed ruthlessness saved lives. Whether that belief was justified is the question that follows. Because by turning leadership failure into a form of living death, Patton solved an immediate problem. But he also created an ethical vacuum where judgment replaced due process and reputation replaced law. And that tension between effectiveness and fairness is where the story truly turns. Officers do not fail in combat the way civilians imagine failure. They do not usually run screaming from the battlefield. They do not openly refuse orders. Most failures are quieter than that. They happen inside the mind, in moments measured in seconds, when pressure compresses time and every decision feels irreversible. By 1944, American infantry officers were operating under conditions few armies had ever sustained: continuous operations, rapid advance fire, fragmented information, and a relentless expectation to move forward regardless of confusion or loss. Leadership, under these conditions, was not about bravery in the abstract. Many discovered reserves of composure they had never known they possessed. They learned to function amid chaos, to give orders even when they were unsure, to project confidence they did not feel. These officers earned their men's trust not through perfection, but through presence. Others did not adapt. Some froze when plans collapsed. Some became paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong decision. Others withdrew psychologically, retreating to bunkers or rear positions where they could observe without acting. From the outside, it looked like cowardice. From the inside, it often felt like overload. The modern term would be combat stress. In 1944, it was simply failure. The problem Patton faced was not whether this stress was real. He knew it was. The problem was that stress did not kill fewer soldiers just because it was understandable. A platoon without leadership was still a platoon exposed to enemy fire. A company without direction still stalled. Under artillery, explanations did not stop bullets. If Patton treated every psychological collapse as a crime, the officer corps would be destroyed. If he treated every collapse as forgivable, soldiers would continue to die under indecisive leadership. Somewhere between cruelty and compassion lay a line he had to draw, and he chose to draw it sharply. Patton believed that leadership in combat was not a universal trait. It was a specific capability that only revealed itself under extreme conditions. Training could prepare an officer, but it could not guarantee performance when reality tested that performance and found it lacking. Patton saw no value in pretending otherwise. This is why patterns mattered more than incidents. War was chaotic. Fear was human, but repeated withdrawal, consistent indecision, or a demonstrated inability to function under fire, marked an officer as incompatible with combat leadership. At that point, Patton did not see punishment as moral judgment. He saw it as quality control, and roles in Patton's mind existed only to serve the mission. This distinction allowed him to bypass the legal framework without feeling unjust. Courts martial existed to punish wrongdoing. What Patton was doing, at least in his own logic, was not punishment. It was removal. An officer who could not lead in combat was reassigned to tasks where his failure would not cost lives. But that reasoning ignored the reality of how the Army experienced such removals, because even if Patton did not intend to humiliate, humiliation was unavoidable. The army was a social system built on performance under fire. Combat leadership was its highest currency. Losing it meant instant devaluation. An officer reassigned to logistics or administration did not simply change jobs. He crossed an invisible boundary. He moved from the world where decisions mattered immediately to the world where they did not. From the center of the war to its margins. Every rear area headquarters was filled with officers who had not advanced, who had stalled, who had been passed over, but those quietly relieved by Patton carried a different weight. They were not merely less successful. They were known to have failed. This knowledge followed them relentlessly. It shaped every interrefi. They did not need to be told they were no longer trusted. Trust had already evaporated. In this environment, redemption was almost impossible. There were no formal charges to contest, no verdict to overturn. There was only Patton's judgment, reinforced daily by silence. An officer could work diligently, perform well in rear assignments, and still remain defined by the moment he froze. His past followed him more closely than his present. Patton accepted this cost without hesitation. From his perspective, the Army could not afford to gamble on rehabilitation at the front. There was no controlled environment for second chances in active combat. Every engagement was a test with immediate consequences. An officer who had already failed once had proven in Patton's eyes that he could not be trusted when it mattered most. This was not mercy. It was triage, and, like all triage, it was indifferent to individual suffering. Patton's critics would later argue that this system ignored the complexity of human psychology, that it conflated temporary breakdown with permanent incapacity, that its second was not ooming for fairness, he was ooming for momentum. The Third Army's rapid advance depended on aggressive leadership at every level. Hesitation at the top of a unit slowed everything beneath it. Patton did not believe he had the luxury to explore nuance when men were dying by the minute. Quietly, efficiently, permanently, and the fear of that removal did something powerful. It sharpened attention. It discouraged withdrawal. It made officers push forward even when instinct urged caution. Whether this produced better leadership or simply more reckless behavior is an open question. But there is no question that it produced compliance. Officers knew that failure would not be debated. By the time the Third Army reached deeper into France, the lesson was fully internalized. Leadership was not just expected, it was enforced psychologically. The war continued to reward those who endured pressure and punish those who could not. Patton's system did not eliminate fear, it weaponized it. And that weapon, more than any legal authority, is what kept the Army moving. Fear does not need orders to spread, it only needs proof. By late August 1944, Patton's system no longer required explanation. No directives were issued. No speeches were given. There was no formal announcement of a new disciplinary doctrine, and yet every officer in the Third Army understood exactly what was at stake. An officer would vanish from the front line, not wounded, not killed, simply gone. His name removed quietly from operational briefings, his replacement already in place. Within days, the rumor network filled in the blanks. Everyone knew why he was no longer there. That knowledge traveled faster than any written order ever could. This is how Patton's approach transformed from a series of decisions into an unwritten policy. Officers did not need to be punished personally to feel the pressure. They only needed to believe that punishment was inevitable if they failed, and belief in a combat army is everything. Fear became ambient. It did not spike during inspections or investigations. It existed constantly beneath the surface, shaping behavior before mistakes were even made. Officers pushed forward, not because they were fearless, but because the cost of hesitation had become unbearable. This fear was not chaotic, it was focused. Patton did not demand perfection. He demanded motion. Officers learned quickly that action demanded motion. Initiative became a form of self-preservation. Even when wrong was preferable to delay. The effect on battalion behavior was immediate. Units moved faster. Attack resumed more quickly after setbacks. Officers took vism leading rather than directing from safety. Leadership be present. You had to be moving. You had to be seen. This visibility mattered because disappearance had become the ultimate threat. No officer wanted to be the one whose absence sparked whispers. No one wanted to be quietly reassigned and never spoken of again. Death at least came with honor. Removal came with silence. Patton understood something crucial about organizational control. Formal discipline operates episodically. It acts after failure continuously. It acts before failure has a chance to manifest. By refusing to codify his system, Patton made it impossible to game. There were no rules to study. Officers could not ask, "How bad does it have to be before this happens?" because no one knew. The boundary was intentionally vague. That ambiguity amplified its fear. Every officer evaluated his own performance constantly, not against written standards, but against Patton's perceived tolerance. And because Patton's tolerance was personal and absolute, the only safe assumption was zero margin for visible failure. Critics later argued that this atmosphere encouraged recklessness, that officers terrified of being seen as hesitant might push men forward and could produce aggression without judgment. Those critics were not wrong, but they misunderstood Patton's objective. Patton was not attempting to create cautious leaders. He was attempting to create momentum. In his calculus, stalled units were more dangerous than aggressive ones. A failed attack could be corrected, a frozen one could not. Fear was not a side effect. It was a tool. The brilliance and the danger of this system lay in its stale. One removal affected dozens of officers. A handful affected hundreds. Soon the entire command structure internalized the threat without Patton needing to act again. This is how leadership discipline became self-enforcing. Officers policed themselves. They watched each other closely. A peer who hesitated was no longer just a liability to soldiers. Reporting failure became easier because silence no longer protected anyone. The system rewarded vigilance. And because removals were quiet, the fear never dissipated. There was no catharsis, no public resolution, just a steady awareness that judgment could fall at any moment. In this environment, Patton's authority grew larger than his rank. His presence alone was enough. The idea of Patton mattered more than Patton himself. Officers did not fear paperwork. They feared his attention. This was leadership by reputation weaponized. But such power came with consequences. Officers lived under constant psychological strain. Every decision carried not only tactical risk, but personal existential. Compounded, some officers thrived under this pressure, sharpening their instincts and confidence. Others deteriorated quietly, terrified of revealing weakness. And because weakness it quietly, terrified of revealing weakness. Patton's system had no space for vulnerability. To admit fear was to invite suspicion. To request relief was to mark oneself. Silence became safer than honesty. From a human perspective, this was brutal. From a military perspective, it worked. The Third Army maintained relentless momentum. Leaders' failures did not accumulate. When an officer faltered, he was replaced instantly. The machine kept moving. The question, then, is not whether Patton's method was harsh. It unquestionably was. The question is whether any other method would have produced the same results under the same conditions. Formal justice emphasized outcome. He was not interested in rehabilitating leaders. He was interested in winning a war as quickly as possible with the men he had, and in that narrow, ruthless context, fear proved to be an efficient substitute for law. By the time the Third Army pushed deeper into Europe, the system no longer required enforcement. It had become culture. Officers no longer asked what Patton would do. They acted as if he was always watching. That is, when fear stops being punishment and becomes governance. And that transformation is what made Patton's choice truly worse than execution. Execution removes individuals. This removed doubt itself. From a purely operational perspective, Patton's system worked. The Third Army did not stall, it did not collapse under leadership failure when officers faltered. They were replaced immediately. Units kept moving. Momentum was preserved. In the brutal arithmetic of war, fewer delays meant fewer casualties. This is the argument Patton would have made, and in many ways history supports it. During the rapid advance across France, Third Army units maintained aggressive tempo despite logistical strain and exhaustion. Leadership gaps were filled before they became fatal. Patton's command avoided the paralysis that plagues slower-moving formations. There were no drawn-out investigations while soldiers waited in exposed positions. No legal proceedings that froze decision-making at critical moments. In that sense, Patton solved a real problem with ruthless efficiency. But efficiency is not the same as justice, and effectiveness does not erase cost. Patton's system did not discriminate between failure caused by incompetence and failure caused by psychological collapse. Both produced the same outcome, both ended careers, both resulted in quiet exile, mattered less than the consequences of allowing it to continue. This assumption simplified command. The Susses were not machines. They were men operating under extreme conditions for prolonged periods. Fear was not a defect. It was an inevitable response to sustained combat. Modern armies would later recognize this through formal concepts like combat stress reaction and PTSD. In 1944, those distinctions barely existed. Patton did not deny fear. He simply refused to accommodate it at the point of command. To him, the battlefield was not a therapeutic environment. It was a test, and tests, by definition, produced failures. The ethical question emerges here unavoidable and unresolved. Is it justifiable to destroy an individual's identity and career without formal process if doing so preserves the lives of others? Is fairness to leaders secondary to effectiveness? For soldiers, and who decides when the balance tips too far? Patton decided, unilaterally, no appeal. This concentration of power was efficient, but it was also dangerous. A system that depends entirely on one man's discernment is only as good as that man's judgment. Spohr argued that Patton's judgment was unusually sharp. He verified reports. He sought corroboration. He did not act on rumor alone. In many cases, failures were clear, repeated, and witnessed by multiple observers. From this perspective, Patton was not arbitrary. He was decisive. Critics counter that decisiveness without transparency invites, but quiet removals hide mistakes as easily as they hide justice. That an officer falsely accused had no recourse. The silence that made the system effective also made it opaque. Both perspectives can be true at the same time. What cannot be denied is the psychological toll imposed by this environment. Officers operated under constant evaluation, not only by superiors, but by peers and subordinates. The pressure to appear decisive could override legitimate tactical judgment. Fear sharpened some leaders. It broke others. Those who thrived under Patton often became legends. Those who did not were erased quietly, their story surviving only in memoirs and fragments of correspondence. This imbalance shapes how Patton is remembered. He is remembered as effective because effectiveness leaves visible results: speed, territory gained, enemy defeated. The casualties avoided by swift leadership cannot be counted easily, but they are assumed. Men reassigned to the rear did not simply lose their roles. Many lost their sense of self. Leadership had been their purpose. Removal was not just professional failure. It was existential collapse. They continued to serve, continued to contribute, but within an identity stripped of meaning. Some accepted this quietly. Others carried resentment for the rest of their lives. A few eventually returned to combat under desperate circumstances late in the war, never fully escaping the stigma of earlier failure. Patton accepted these outcomes because he believed the alternative was worse. He believed that allowing weak leadership to persist was a betrayal of the soldiers who depended on it, that protecting officers' dignity at the expense of combat effectiveness was immoral, that war did not permit the luxury of extended compassion. This belief aligns with a certain tradition of command, one that dramatizes outcome over process, victory over individual welfare, the mission above all else. But even within that tradition, Patton's approach stood out for its severity. Other armies used courts-martial. Some executed officer publicly. Those systems were brutal, but they were formal. Patton rejected that structure entirely. He replaced law with reputation, procedure with judgment, punishment with erasure. This made his system faster and more flexible. It also removed safeguards. The unsettling truth is that both sides of the argument draw strength from the same evidence. Patton's army moved faster. At the same time, his system denied basic procedural protections and inflicted lasting psychological harm on individuals without accountability. There is no clean resolution. Patton did not design his approach to be fair. He designed it to win. The moral weight of that choice depends entirely on whether one believes that war suspends ordinary ethical standards or merely intensifies the need for them. What makes this story endure is not the answer but the tension. Patton could have followed the law and executed failed officers. That would have been legally justified. He could have convened courts-martial and allowed formal defense. That would have been procedurally correct. Instead, he chose a third path, one that maximized control, speed, and deterrence while minimizing transparency and mercy. It worked and it damaged people. Both facts coexist. And that is why Patton's decision continues to disturb long after the battles themselves have faded. Patton's decision feels extreme only if it is viewed in isolation. In reality, every major army in World War II faced the same problem. Officers failed under fire, leader froze, men broke. The difference was not whether this happened, but how each military chose to respond. When it did, most armies defaulted to law, formal and charges. Witness testimony, a system designed to separate individual failure from institution blame, the Auchu-Kofklai. Trials took time, evidence had to be gathered, verdicts had to be reached. Appeals followed. In a static war, that delay was tolerable. In a war of rapid maneuver, it was crippling. When officers were prosecuted openly, the institution itself came under scrutiny. Questions spread beyond the individual. How were these men selected? How were they trained? Why were they trusted in the first place? What other failures were being hidden? Patton understood this richer failure to become a subject of public discussion, not because he feared criticism, but because he feared distraction. A distracted army is a slow army, and a slow army dies. Other forces accepted this cost. Some even embraced it. The British Army, for example, relied heavily on formal discipline. Courts-martial for cowardice existed and were occasionally enforced. These punishments were public, documented, and legally justified. They also generated controversy that lasted decades after the war ended. The British system bronipized institutional legitimacy. The law was followed even when the outcomes were brutal. The price was visibility. Once punishment entered the legal record, it became part of national memory. German forces approached the problem differently, relying on ideological indoctrination and rigid hierarchy. Failure was framed not as personal weakness, but as betrayal. Punishments were severe, often lethal, and enforced through fear at every level. This produced compliance, but also desperation. He did not want legal debate, and he did not want ideological terror. He wanted speed, control, and plausible deniability. His system delivered all three by keeping removals informal. Patton avoided creating a narrative larger than the individual. There were no trials to analyze, no verdicts to protest, no documents to leak. The story ended where it began, with the officer quietly disappearing from combat command. This silence was not accidental. It was strategic. Silence prevents solidarity. An officer court-martial becomes a symbol. Others rally to his defense. An officer removed quietly becomes an absence, not a cause. Patton understood that armies do not fracture over disappearances. They fracture over public injustice. By refusing to formalize punishment, Patton denied failed officers the ability to frame themselves as victims. There was no platform, no audience, no moment of confrontation, only exile. This is what made the punishment worse than execution. But this approach required something rare in military command: absolute authority paired with absolute confidence. Patton did not fear second-guessing because he did not allow space for it. His decisions were not designed to withstand scrutiny. They were designed to be irreversible. This makes his leadership deeply unsettling by modern standards. Contemporary military doctrine emphasized transparency, accountability, and procedural fairness. Literacy to versenzo documented precisely to Brechen. Patton's system minimize oversight, and trusted one man's judgment to outweigh. His instincts aligned with battlefield reality. His removals in most documented cases addressed genuine leadership collapse. But the system itself offered no protection against error. Had Patton misjudged an officer, there was no mechanism to correct the mistake. There was no appeal. The same silence that preserved momentum also erased accountability. Patton accepted this risk because he believed the alternative risk was greater. He believed that hesitation at the front cost more lives than injustice at the rear. That imperfect leadership removed quickly was preferable to legal perfection delayed. That war rewarded decisiveness, not deliberation. In this sense, Patton's approach was not about punishment at all. It was about triage. When resources are limited, not everyone can be saved. Patton allocated them ruthlessly. Officers who could not perform were reassigned where failure was survivable. Those who could perform remained at the point of danger. This framing allows Patton's decision to appear cold, but rational. It also spares the cost of maintaining effectiveness. Patton chose that someone to be failed officers rather than frontline soldiers. Whether that choice is acceptable depends entirely on where one believes moral responsibility lies in war. Patton believed it lay with results. He refused the paths of law and ideology not because they were wrong but because they were slow. He replaced them with judgment and fear, tools that operated instantly and invisibly. The Third Army advanced. The system succeeded, but success built on silence leaves unresolved questions behind. Questions about fairness, about error, about the cost of giving one man the power to decide who is worthy of command without explanation. Those questions linger precisely because Patton never answered them, and that silence, like his punishment, endures. In the end, Patton never denied what he had done. He did not hide behind paperwork. He did not claim ignorance, and he never pretended his system was gentle. To Patton, the question was never whether his punishment was cruel. The question was whether cruelty, when precisely applied, saved lives. He believed it did. Execution is absolute, but it is also clean. It ends responsibility. It ends memory. A man who was shot is no longer part of the system that condemned him. His story freezes in place, sealed by death. The Army moves on. Patton did not want closure. He wanted memory to linger. While allowing failed officers to live to remain inside the Army they had failed, Patton ensured the punishment never truly ended. Every day became a reminder. Every briefing, every report from the front, every medal awarded to someone else reinforced the loss. The war continued, but without them this was not justice as law understands it. It was justice as culture enforces it. The officers Patton removed did not vanish from history because they were executed. They vanished because they were irrelevant. Their names faded, not through scandal but through silence, and silence, in a profession built on recognition and command, is annihilation. He preserved their pay. He allowed them to continue serving, and yet he destroyed the one thing they valued above all else, the right to lead men in battle. Patton believed this was fair, not fair to the officers, but fair to the soldiers. Soldiers deserved leaders who could function under fire. Soldiers deserved commanders who would not hesitate when lives depended on motion. Soldiers did not owe officers the comfort of process if that process endangered them. From this perspective, Patton's system becomes grimly logical. Leadership is not a right. It is a responsibility that must be revoked the moment it fails. The cost of delay is measured in blood, not careers, but logic does not erase unease. Because once punishment becomes informal, once judgment replaces procedure, the line between discipline and domination blurs. Patton's system worked because it was feared. It endured because it was silent. These are not qualities normally celebrated in systems of justice. They are qualities associated with power. The uncomfortable truth is that Patton did not merely discipline officers. He reshaped belief. He taught his army that failure would not be debated, only remembered that fear could be more reliable than law, that leadership could be enforced psychologically rather than legally. And it worked precisely because officers believed in it. They believed Patton was watching. They believed removal was final. They believed survival without command was worse than death. Belief did the rest. This raises the question that cannot be answered cleanly. Was Patton protecting soldiers or protecting momentum at any cost? Was he eliminating danger or simply relocating it from the battlefield to the human mind? Did his system create stronger leaders or merely leaders who learned to hide weakness more effectively? History does not give us a verdict. Leadership failures did not accumulate. UNOS did not stagnate. The campaign succeeded. At the same time, officers were broken quietly. Career ended without appeal. Psychological wounds were inflicted deliberately and left untreated. The human cost was real, even if it was invisible. And in a world where delay killed, he chose the form of punishment that acted fastest and frightened deepest. This is why his decision still unsettles. Not because it was illegal, it was not. Not because it was ineffective, it was not. But because it forces a question that has no comfortable answer. If you had the legal right to execute those who failed you, and you believed that letting them live would terrify others into performing better, would you choose mercy or something worse? Patton chose something worse, and the fact that it worked may be the most disturbing part of all. Patton believed letting them live was worse than executing them. Do you think he was protecting his soldiers or crossing a line no commander should cross? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone.